So a big focus of this afternoon then has been that briefing that has just ended by Chief Justice-designate Rayomd Zondo. Let me take you to Chris Oxtoby, who is with the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town. Chris, perhaps before we get into the nitty-gritty of what it is that Justice Zondo has said, maybe let's just reflect on the tone that has been set through this media briefing. It is an important one given the fact that it's the first time that we're really hearing from him since the announcement that he'll be taking that top job.
Yes, that's right. It's an interesting approach. I mean, of course, traditionally this wasn't the kind of thing that one would see judges doing. Obviously, we live in a different world and a different news cycle to when those conventions were established. I don't think Justice Zondo has also briefed the media before, for example, in the judiciary's response to the Lindiwe Sisulu op-ed a few months ago. So I think it's a positive thing to see that he is willing to answer questions and to present a public face to the media. I think there may be some people who might have concerns that he shouldn't spend too much time in the public eye, bearing in mind all that needs to be done in the judiciary at the moment.
You know, the interesting thing is that this is something that he came under critique for during his JSC interviews, that, you know, perhaps he had been too vocal on some issues. He was quick to call media conferences, etc. But on the other hand, you really see somebody who's saying that they're going to be taking on this position by their own rules. And interesting that despite that heavy critique, he still is willing to sit down, open himself up to a multitude of questions from journalists.
Yes, it is interesting. I mean, it was something that many people commented on with his predecessor when Justice Mogoeng was Chief Justice, that he took on a much more prominent public profile in terms of these kind of engagements. As I said, compared to how perhaps previous Chief Justices might have approached it. I think one can certainly look at it as a positive, that the judiciary is using this as a way of accounting to the public, as a way of being open to the public. But of course, one just has to be a little bit careful about how far that extends, because at the bottom line, they are judges who have to decide cases in court, and you don't want a situation where something that's been said in a press conference suddenly comes back and becomes an issue in that case. But I think especially at the beginning of his, or just before his official tenure as Chief Justice begins, it's probably a positive thing for people to have had this engagement and to have heard his thoughts on these issues.
They're really important questions that he has been asked during this afternoon's session, and I think a lot of them really centering around the state of the JSC, which is a body that he'll now be tasked with in as far as ensuring that there is some structure, efficiency, and to the extent that there have been calls around, its credibility, questions rather, about its credibility, he will be the person that will need to lead that process. What did you make of what he had to say overall in his impressions about the work of the JSC?
I think he was quite complimentary about the JSC, which is a constructive way to begin things. Even though, of course, the questions that he himself was subjected to during his interview for Chief Justice did raise a lot of eyebrows in terms of the fairness of some of those questions. So I think that we knew before this interview, and it was pleasing to hear the Justice Zondo re-emphasize this, that the JSC is planning to hold a meeting at the beginning of their next sitting in April to discuss various aspects of their mandate, and Justice Zondo has re-emphasized that. So I think it's definitely positive that engagement is happening, and that it's confirmed that that's happening. It's easy to be impatient to hear a little bit more about what's actually going to be discussed and what might come out of that. because you heard Justice Zondo also allude to the fact that that issue had been touched on in October last year when he chaired the JSC at the time. So one might ask the question of, well, why has it taken this long for the JSC to actually have that kind of convening? Because there have been a lot of issues in the recent rounds of interviews. If one thinks back to April last year when CASAC challenged the JSC's interviews at the Constitutional Court, that resulted in those interviews having to be redone. We then had the controversy about the Chief Justice interviews in February of this year. So there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed in terms of the criteria the JSC applies, in terms of its procedures, in terms of making sure that fair and equal questions are being asked of candidates. So we've thought that this has really got to be one of the main priority issues for him. And one just hopes that the JSC doesn't fall into a cycle of simply having talks about talks, but really engages in the core issues when it does meet to discuss them.
And Chris, while fairness is paramount, especially for interview processes such as those that the JSC is tasked with from time to time, I'm also interested to see the way in which he, as somebody who has been subjected to that level of scrutiny, comes out of it having an appreciation for the level of robustness. And I wonder, Chris, given where we are as a society and given just the political landscape that exists in the country right now, that we can actually afford, and if it's actually possible, to get through interview processes of that nature without asking what seem to be the really uncomfortable questions that step on people's toes, and have the process be seen as a credible one posted.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think certainly, the uncomfortable questions should be asked. What I think is important is that all the questions that candidates are asked must all be directed towards a basic question of criteria. In other words, what are we actually looking for in our judges? The problem I think we've seen with the JSC in these public interviews for a long time is that there doesn't seem to be that sort of consensus or shared understanding, and so there is not really much basis for the interviews to be controlled and focused when questions get asked that go well beyond looking at what criteria you need to be a good judge in South Africa. So I think one can have both. I think one can have interviews that are courteous, respectful, and broadly fair, but are also rigorous and also ask the difficult questions to test whether or not a candidate is suitable for the position. And it's absolutely essential that those kind of questions are asked as well. I think some of what we've seen over the last couple of rounds in the interviews I mentioned, though, has gone well beyond that into territory which just hasn't been appropriate.
I also want us to then talk about his reflections on the state of the judiciary. Unsurprising that the questions about the capture of the judiciary, or the attempted capture of the judiciary, and the extent to which, he will be an independent player, again, given the kind of aspersions that were cast on his character, even during that JSC interview process. What did you get from him in as far as his approach is? And I think what he said was also quite important, that it's not only important for the judiciary to say that it is independent, but it's even more so important for the judiciary to demonstrate its independence.
Yes, absolutely. It must do so. I think he hit all the right notes in terms of how strongly he emphasized the importance of the judiciary being independent, how strongly he asserted his own independence, and also he made a telling point about those who have allegations of capture and so on and so forth, needing to actually bring forward that evidence and provide evidence, because I think this whole discourse about the supposed capture of the judiciary has been, long on allegations, but short on evidence to support them. So until we see any particularly concrete evidence of what could be classified as judicial capture, I really think the judiciary has to be given the benefit of the doubt. And Justice Zondo's been very, very strong in his statements today, and also previously, such as in his interview. He's been very strong in his statements asserting that independent role of the judiciary. So I think, you allude to the political climate that we're in, and I think in that climate it's perhaps inevitable that we are just going to continue to get a lot of these kind of allegations being made against the judiciary. But it's important that the judiciary is supported, and that it's understood what role they are there to play. And I think that in the absence of concrete evidence showing the capture of individual judges or of an institution, we owe it to our judges to support them in the work that they do.
Chris, 24 months isn't an awful lot of time, but given what we've heard from the Chief Justice-designate, your sense of what we can expect out of his time in that seat?
You're right. It's not a long period of time, and I think that was one of the concerns that was raised right at the beginning about him as a candidate. I think what was interesting is when he was invited to identify what his core area of priority was going to be, he picked up on continuing reforms to the governance and administration of the judiciary to try and ensure the independence of the institution. That's been a long ongoing project that really started with the establishment of the Office of the Chief Justice in 2010. So given that timeline, and given the fact that that process is by Justice Zondo's own telling not yet completed, that suggests to us that 24 months is going to be difficult for him to achieve perhaps the results that he wants to. But that's a really important issue, and I think even if he can take us further along that path during the rest of his tenure, that'll be a very powerful legacy for him to leave for his successor.
Chris Oxtoby, let's leave it there for this afternoon, and of course he's with the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town.